Hello, I'm Barbara Batson, Exhibitions Coordinator at the Library of Virginia, and I'm in the exhibition Indigenous Perspectives. In our conversations with many of the 11 state and federally recognized tribes in Virginia, we heard a lot about identity and particularly the impact of the 1924 Racial Integrity Act. As we researched the documents related to that act of the General Assembly, we stumbled upon something a little unexpected in the federal census. It's a little complicated, but then what history isn't. So this is going to be a quick overview of what we found. I am not an expert. This is just what I have seen. Now, the federal census has always gathered information on ethnicity or race. Between 1790 and 1850, the census gathered data on free whites, other free persons, and those enslaved. In 1850, the census for the first time used the term mulatto, meaning a person of mixed color. In 1860, enumerators listed persons as Indian if they were taxed, that is, if those persons were detached from their tribe and living in the white community and were subject to general taxation, or were living on land allotted by the federal government and thus had become naturalized citizens. Remember, Native Americans were not recognized as citizens of the United States until 1924. A complete census of the Indian population was conducted in 1910 and included citizens of the Pamunkey and the Mattaponi who lived on their reservations, as well as other indigenous communities such as the Chickahominy who did not have a reservation. Enumerators of Native peoples living on reservations or in family groups outside of reservations used a special modified schedule for the 1910 census, which included an extra page of questions, including a question about the proportion of blood lineage or blood quantum. There was also an interesting question about residence and dwelling. Is the person living in a civilized or aboriginal dwelling? If the enumerator marked CIV, that meant the person lived in a log, frame, brick, or stone house. ABOR, meant that the person was living in a tent, teepee, or cliff dwelling. In 1920, the federal census didn't have a separate Indian population census, and so the enumerator guidelines really didn't include anything specific about Indians. So Native peoples such as Henry G. Atkins, who in 1910 was listed as Indian, Chickahominy, and lived off the reservation or out into the community, now is listed as mulatto, perhaps because the enumerator thought they were of mixed lineage and therefore you went with the lineage of the father. So the rest of the Chickahominy, including Ozias Westmore Atkins, who was chief, was also listed as mulatto. The 1930 federal census still recognized Indian as a racial category, although the guidelines were specific about reporting interracial people. A person of mixed white and black lineage was recorded as black or Negro, to use the 1930 term. A person who was both white and Indian was recorded as Indian unless the native lineage was very small and the person was accepted as white within the community. But a person of mixed Indian and black blood was Negro unless the Indian blood predominated and the person was generally accepted as an Indian in the community. That's important. The enumerator for the Harrison District in Charles City County reported that Ozias W. Atkins and his family were Indian. Several Branham families in Amherst County also were listed as Indian. This may indicate that the enumerators, following federal instructions, recognized that the proportion of their Indian blood was 1/4 or more, or that these families were regarded as Indian in their communities. Native peoples on reservations were classified as Indian. For persons noted as Indian, the enumerator had to indicate whether the person was full blood or mixed blood, as well as the name of the tribe. But at any rate, Virginia Indians in 1930 could be reported as Indians regardless of Virginia's Racial Integrity Act. Now, 1940 is a totally different story. By then, the campaign to erase Native identity in Virginia, at least on paper, was relentless, and that is reflected in the census sheets. The federal government still required enumerators to classify a person of mixed racial lineage as the race of the father, although persons of mixed Indian and Negro blood were considered Negro, again using the term of the period. But here's something interesting. The enumerator for the Burnt House District in Amherst County noted that several families were Indian, perhaps because they were recognized as Indian in their communities, and that was allowed by federal guidelines. But look carefully. Someone has marked off the IN, or the Indian designation for each person, and written 2 to indicate the racial designation as Negro. And even the Mattaponi who lived on their reservation lands were subjected to this kind of change. Who made the change? Was it a federal census worker or someone in the Virginia Bureau of Statistics? We don't know, but it does speak to the difficulty of Indigenous Virginians to maintain recognition of their identity, as well as to the insidious nature of eugenics and the obsession, it's not another word for it, for racial purity. Now, guidelines in the 1950 census changed yet again. Although persons of mixed Indian and Black ancestry were to be considered Negro, the census had an exception for special communities in the eastern United States. The enumerator was instructed to report, quote, persons of mixed white, Negro, and Indian ancestry in terms of the name by which they are locally known. The communities in question are long-standing and locally recognized. So perhaps that's why in 1950, Ozias W. Atkins' son, who was the Chickahominy, and his family and relatives are reported now as Indian rather than Negro, and the reservation Mattaponi are correctly reported as Indian. Census records are incredibly useful for genealogists to trace their families and for policymakers who mine the data for a variety of purposes. The Census Bureau readily admits that inaccuracies exist, but as historical documents, the data recorded on the sheets cannot be changed. So, who made the changes in 1940? So this is just a reminder that when you use census records, just be aware that not everything is as it seems. If you visit the exhibition Indigenous Perspectives, which will remain on view at the Library of Virginia through Saturday, August 17th, 2024, you can see some of these census documents and have a look for yourself. And they are, of course, available online through Ancestry.com.